Hi everyone. Here in America, we had the holiday Flag Day last week, and we'll have our Independence Day in a couple of weeks. So in honor of both of these, I thought we'd take a look today at an iconic American patriotic song. While this song is easily recognized today and heard often around this time of year, it originally had a different title and lyrics, both of which were actually initially somewhat controversial. So today, let's take a look at the classic American patriotic song, "You're a Grand Old Flag." "You're a Grand Old Flag" was written by songwriter, actor, singer, dancer, and theatrical producer George M. Cohan. Cohan was quite successful during the first few decades of the 1900s, wrote and starred in several musical comedies, and was known for being unabashedly patriotic, even claiming that he was born on the 4th of July, although it might have actually been the 3rd. Among his song hits from this time are "Give My Regards to Broadway," "The Yankee Doodle Boy," and "Over There." In 1906, Cohan wrote George Washington Jr., a musical comedy about two feuding senators, each trying to find dirt on the other and their families who get caught in between. The show opened on February 12, 1906, ran for 81 performances, and featured 9 songs, the third of which in the show was "You're a Grand Old Rag." The song was sung in the show by the character George Belgrave, who was actually played by George M. Cohan himself. Now, the rag referred to in this song is not any old rag or a ragtime song, but of course the U.S. flag. And this somewhat unusual phrase for the flag actually came from an experience Cohan had had with a Civil War veteran. The story goes that this veteran and Cohan were in each other's company one day, perhaps at a home for Civil War veterans, or maybe even riding next to each other in a parade. And Cohan noticed that the veteran was holding a carefully folded but ragged and tattered old American flag. The man reportedly then turned to Cohan and explained that he had been the color bearer of his regiment at Gettysburg, and that both he and his flag had been hit by enemy fire. Then, speaking of the flag, he said, "She's a grand old rag." Cohan apparently thought that this was a great line, and so used it in the lyrics of the song and titled it, "You're a Grand Old Rag." Now, there's actually one more wrinkle when looking at the original name of this song, because it seems to have been known by two similar but different titles. The original sheet music calls this song "You're a Grand Old Rag," but IMDb states that in the initial run of the musical, this song was known as just "The Grand Old Rag." And this is backed up by an original recording of the song from 1906, which also shows the title of the song as "The Grand Old Rag." I'm not sure how this song ended up with these two similar but distinct titles. It might have simply been a simple clerical error, but it seems that the confusion probably comes from which part of the lyrics the title is being taken. So let's take a look at the lyrics now and see what they say. The song follows the older style of a rigid-pop song format, with a much longer verse section followed by a shorter chorus. This song has 2 verses, both of which just set the stage, explaining that the singer is a very patriotic individual who loves his country and his flag. But the titular phrase doesn't appear until the very end of both verses, and then is heard twice more in the chorus. Both verses end with the phrase, "Honest, you're a grand old rag," and the chorus starts out, "You're a grand old rag, you're a high-flying flag." The rest of the chorus is almost identical to what we hear today, with the exception of "under red, white, and blue" in place of "neath the red, white, and blue." And then the song ends with, "Keep your eye on the grand old rag." So the first instances of the phrase, both at the end of the verses and the beginning of the chorus, consist of "You're a grand old rag," while the last finishes off the song with the simpler phrase, "The Grand Old Rag." So it seems like the 2 separate titles by which the original version of this song was known come from these 2 different places in the lyrics. But this is really minor, and the main takeaway was that this song, extolling the virtues and importance of the U.S. flag, called that banner a rag, both in the title and multiple times in the lyrics. And actually, many individuals and groups, including military veterans and patriotic societies, objected to this. There's even a letter to the editor of the New York Times from February 15, 1906, 3 days after George Washington Jr. opened in New York, in which an individual writes, "I want to protest through your columns against a song entitled 'The Grand Old Rag,' now being sung at one of the theaters. I think a protest should be honored against such an inapt and offensive designation of the Stars and Stripes. Cohen, however, apparently believed that this protest was actually instigated by a New York drama critic who had been denied seats to George Washington Jr. But regardless, he did end up changing the title and lyrics of the song in response to the backlash. But the story of how and when the lyrics changed is actually quite interesting and fairly circuitous. Instead of just one simple change to get us from the original to the version we know today, there were actually multiple changes to the lyrics, which seem to have taken place over at least a decade. So let's go through the various versions of the song to see what changes were made and when. The first major change we can see is the title. Here's the original cover for the version we've been looking at so far, and here's the cover to the subsequent version. So obviously rag has been changed to flag for the title of the song, and from this point on, the song has always been known as You're a Grand Old Flag. But the changes to the lyrics are where it gets interesting. Now, it seems like one change that was made initially and then always stayed the same was the end of the song, where every version I've seen after the initial rag version runs, "Keep your eye on the grand old flag." But the lyrics seen at the end of the verse and the beginning of the chorus seem to have had multiple changes. Here's what one version reads: "Honest, you're a grand old rag. You're a grand old flag, though you're torn to a rag." And here's another version: "Honest, you're a grand old flag. You're a grand old flag, though you're torn to a rag." Those two are almost the exact same, except for the last word of the verse. I don't know if that really reflects two separate versions or if there was just a printing error on one. And both of these versions have the exact same cover and copyright information. And here's the script from the return engagement of the musical George Washington Jr., which took place the following year after a national tour, running for 40 performances from February 11th to March 11th, 1907. Here we can see the same lyrics as we just saw on the second sheet music version, with the end of the verse and beginning of the chorus running, "Honest, you're a grand old flag. You're a grand old flag, though you're torn to a rag." So it seems that at least through 1907, this was the version that was officially released. But of course, this is not the version we know today, as it still has that reference to the rag in there. Now, maybe that shouldn't be too surprising, since the way the song is introduced in the play is similar to the real story that inspired the song, with veterans carrying an old ragged flag, and the phrase, "This is a grand old rag," spoken before the song starts. But it still leaves us with the question of when the version we know today became standard. For that, we actually have to move forward about 10 years. It seems that in 1915, music publisher Maurice Richmond purchased the rights to You're a Grand Old Flag from Frederick Allen Mills, along with other Cohen compositions, and began to publish a new version of the song. This newly published version had a similar but slightly different cover, and here finally we see the final set of lyrics with which we are so familiar today. This final version gets rid of the "though you're torn to a rag" line from the preceding version, and pretty much just goes back to the original first line of the chorus and just substitutes flag for rag. Now, I did actually see a copy of this song on eBay, which appears to have this same updated copyright info and similar cover, but actually also has the earlier second version of the lyrics. Again, I'm not sure if this was purposeful and indicates a separate, distinct published version, or if it was just another mistake or printing error. But regardless, it seems that at least around 1915, the final version of the lyrics, the one we still sing today, was published and available to the public. And every subsequently published version I've seen, like this one, from when the Cohen biopic Yankee Doodle Dandy was released, seems to have these final lyrics as well. But interestingly, I can't actually find out whether it was Cohen himself who revised these lyrics or if he even approved of them at all. Also, this final set of lyrics isn't actually quite as good lyrically as either of the earlier two. See, the original line, as well as the first edit, rhymes the word flag with rag, but the modern version just rhymes the word flag with itself, which isn't as good. But at this point in time, these new lyrics actually worked better than either of the earlier ones, because by this time, the show the song was from was probably mostly forgotten, as was the original context for the song, and so it just wouldn't have made any sense to refer to the flag as a rag. So overall, this song has multiple versions of lyrics, and while the story of when and how they all changed is not terribly clear or straightforward, the key takeaways are that it started out with the word rag in several places, including the title. This was changed due to backlash, and the word rag was only left in once. And then, as time displaced the song from its original context, the word rag was removed completely, and we were left with the version we are used to hearing today. Now, in addition to tracing the history of the lyrical changes by looking at the sheet music, we can do roughly the same thing by looking at various early recordings of the song. When the song was first published, before the changes to the title and lyrics, a few recordings were actually made featuring those original lyrics. One was a version sung by Arthur Collins, though this seems to be incredibly rare, and the other was the one we saw briefly earlier, sung by Billy Murray, a very popular singer and recording artist of the day. This version, which was recorded in February 1906, around the time the show opened, can still be found online today.
Honest, you're a grand old rag, you're a grand old rag, you're a high-flying flag, and forever in peace may you wave.
Then, after the backlash to the title and lyrics, Billy Murray recorded a new version with the newly updated second set of lyrics for Edison Records. This cylinder record, which dates to either later on in 1906 or early 1907, can also be heard online, including on the Wikipedia article for the song.
Honest, you're a grand old flag, you're a grand old flag, though you're torn to a rag, and forever in peace may you wave.
And then, about a decade later, in 1917, Murray can be heard singing this song yet again as part of the vocal group American Quartet, this time singing the finalized, updated lyrics we know today.
Honest, you're a grand old flag, you're a grand old flag, you're a high-flying flag, and forever in peace may you wave.
A couple of these Murray versions are also interesting because they include both of the introductory verses, which most people today have never heard. So now, let's briefly go over the music to these verses as well as the chorus, because there's an element to the music that is almost as interesting as the story behind the lyrics. First, we can see, as mentioned before, that the verse is fairly lengthy at 40 measures long. It doesn't really follow a standard form, but starts off with a repeating bit of 2 8-measure sections, before moving all over the place and doing really different things. The chorus is a bit more standard, following a 32-bar A-B-A-C form. But what's really interesting about this song is how much it borrows from other songs. Now, interpolating a musical phrase from an earlier song into a new one wasn't too uncommon at the time, and had been done before by George M. Cohan, most famously in his 1904 song, The Yankee Doodle Boy. But in this song, he brings in snippets of 4 other songs, 3 of which are heard in the verse, with 1 found in the chorus. It starts after that initial repeating 8-bar section with an interpolation of the well-known but nowadays controversial Southern song, Dixie, or I Wish I Was in Dixie's Land. It's quite short, only 2 measures, but is followed just 6 measures later by another song clip, this time from the more obscure Civil War song, Marching Through Georgia. This 4-measure section is followed directly by yet another interpolation, also 4 measures long, this time coming from Cohan's earlier hit, The Yankee Doodle Boy. The final interpolation comes in the chorus, and as a result is probably fairly well known to most people. The first 4 measures of the final C section of the chorus are taken directly from the traditional Scottish folk song, Auld Lang Syne. Each of these interpolations are almost exact copies musically, and at least in the first verse, very similar lyrically as well. But again, most of these are pretty unknown due to the fact that the verses are so seldom heard nowadays. The first verse only can be heard in a cover by the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, but again, it's quite rare to hear the first verse at all, let alone the second verse. But despite all this, the multiple changes to lyrics and title, the declining popularity of the verses, and the relative current obscurity of the musical in which it was introduced, the song has nevertheless achieved a great amount of success and popularity. It was the first song from a musical to sell over 1 million copies of sheet music, and the song has maintained its popularity remarkably well throughout the past 120 years. It has received multiple covers from famous artists and been included as part of Patriotic and Cohan-based medleys numerous times. It's been heard hundreds of times on film, television, and stage, including 2 separate looks at the life of its composer. And instrumental versions are often played by marching bands and military bands, especially on patriotic holidays such as Flag Day and 4th of July. It has also been adapted, as have many other Origipop songs, for use as a fight song for multiple sports teams, but I'll address this topic more in a future video. Overall, the song You're a Grand Old Flag has had a long and interesting history. Despite its controversial original lyrics and title, it has evolved from a simple number in an old forgotten musical to one of America's most well-known patriotic songs. It has become embedded in Americans' collective cultural consciousness, and despite the divisions our country seems to be facing these days, I hope that all of us can come together, live up to our country's ideals, and be united under our grand old flag. Thanks for watching.